I know, and we're recording, I think. Jeremy Johnston, thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, happy to be here and share my experiences.
So, for those who don't know, my name is Ben Fellows. I run Loop QA, and today I'm joined by Jeremy Johnston. Jeremy Johnston is currently the software engineering manager at ForeFlight. You were recently director of engineering at a number of different companies, chief technology officer at a couple different companies. You've worked for Amazon, Deloitte, sort of a whole host of different careers. What I'm really excited to talk to you about today is a little bit about engineering's leaders' perspective on the role of QA, how QA can be successful. For those of the first time you're listening to these conversations, really the goal of this series is going to be to focus on trying to provide more insights for QA who are joining startups and oftentimes don't necessarily have that director of quality to give them guidance, as well as QA in larger organizations, really for that person that's at the top of your food chain and they're like, what are they looking for? What are they wanting? And so before we get into that, Jeremy, anything about your background or anything that I missed that you want to add to this?
And you did a great job introducing.
Well, I'm practicing. Who knows?
We've known each other for a little while now, and I think I have a pretty diverse background because I've worked in very, very large organizations as well as very small startups. Even had my own startup company for a little while there as well.
Awesome. Yeah. No, and it's been a journey, and that's why I'm really excited to kind of see your perspective. So to get started, when you think about your career as an engineer, particularly as you jumped from being an engineer to more of an engineer in the leadership capacity, how has your perspective of QA evolved over your sort of career? How has it changed? What's morphed most for you?
Yeah, I think going from engineering into engineering leadership. Yeah, as an engineer, my view of QA was very, very small, very focused on what was in front of me and ensuring that my code was, accurately tested with whatever kind of unit tests that might encompass. And as I've moved more into the leadership side of things, then it becomes a much more strategic discussion. And, strategically, how do we want to think about QA? How much importance are we putting on QA? And, so it really shifts from very tactical to very, very strategic, I would say.
And so when it comes to QA and across your backgrounds, how often do you feel like, for the most part, there's always been formal QA operations? I mean, obviously, actually, you and I, we should sort of acknowledge, have worked together at times in the past. But how different has QA looked in the different organizations that you've been a part of?
Very different, but very much the same in many aspects. I would say every experience I've had, it never seems like there's enough QA. It seems like QA is sometimes an afterthought. And I think it's been very different depending on the organization too. I think one of the things as an engineering leader that I look at is what is the product that we're building here, right? Because, I've worked in many different industries on many different products. And I think it really comes down to look, if we had unlimited time and unlimited money, then yes, absolutely, we would want to QA everything. We'd regression test every time we check in, right? We would do everything by the book, but we never have, unlimited time and money. And so, I think one of the things I always look at as an engineering leader is, what are we building? Because if we're building something that is mission critical or that lives depend on it, right, you're going to take a very different approach to QA on that product than you would with something that is a little bit more of a light touch, right? And so, that's what I'm typically looking at to decide how much focus and how much energy we're going to put into this QA program.
QA as an afterthought is interesting because I can almost guarantee I know a lot of folks who are in QA organizations right now who feel like even within their organization, QA is kind of an afterthought. And then, like you kind of preface, there's a lot of reasons why that could be, but to sort of drill into that for a second, how should that person be feeling? Like, how should that, is it sort of up to that QA to recognize, look, there's limited capacity, or maybe we aren't in a life and death situation. Like in an organization where that QA, and maybe it's one or two QA, and they don't really have a director who's advocating for them, and they're sort of like, we feel like the afterthought. Is there things that they can do to make their life easier? How do they change their organization's perspective? Do they operate the best in it? What would be your advice in that situation?
I think, become an advocate for yourself, and, try to take a look at, or try to put yourself in the shoes of the leaders of your organization, and realize there's not unlimited time and money, and try to, determine what level should QA be, right? And try to, try to do things to speak up and advocate for yourself if you believe that QA is being undervalued, right? I think that a lot of times as an engineering leader, there's so much focus on, delivery of new content, or, pushing out new features, right? And, the customers want it tomorrow, right? And so we can't bypass development. The development has to happen. And so I think there's a lot of pressure sometimes to say, well, we've got great developers. Let's get it developed and let's push it out. Let's, we want to push it through QA, but let's do as minimal QA as we should. And I think, as a QA engineer, that's where your responsibility comes in to say, guys, wait a minute, I think we need to spend more time on QA, because this is critical, right? This is impacting X number of users, or if we screw this up, something devastating could happen. And I think a lot of times it just takes some speaking up from a QA engineer and giving that perspective to your engineering manager, because they're hearing it from the other end. They're hearing it from the top to say, push out these new features, go, go, go. And sometimes we just don't stop to think about what happens if, we don't put the right amount of attention into QA. And as a QA engineer, you're in the right position to be able to speak up and say that. And I would appreciate, that perspective.
Yeah, I think it's interesting listening to you immediately going, oh yeah, like you have all of your business leaders on top of that person being like, why isn't this feature out? And it's very hard to be like, oh, well, we're fixing bugs and slow. And it's like, oh, we're now in regression testing. They just go, well, why can't that go faster? Right. Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. And what's interesting listening to that is a lot of QA folks are engineers. They're not necessarily people who want to be communicating or fighting. And it's interesting because recently I've started talking a little bit about like QA with an attitude as a joke in some ways, but this idea of like QA is a much more conflict-oriented role than I think people want to give it credit for, and the emotional intelligence needed to balance your product people, your engineers, your business people, and to advocate for these larger windows or changes of practices. Where have you seen that done really successfully? And without specifics, but like what kind of processes do you feel like you've seen that was being done successfully where a QA has actually been able to implement change in the organization? Does anything come to mind, or is that too specific?
Well, I think, there has been, situations where I think as an engineering leader and growing up being an engineer, I'm not an expert at QA. And I think that that's the case with a lot of engineers and engineering leaders. I think, they've come up from the engineering side and not from the QA side in general. So for me, it's when I've worked with, more experienced QA engineers that are able to give me that perspective, that are able to say, we should really be automating this, or, I think that's where it's worked best for me. It's like, give me sort of, your perspective of what we should be doing, because you come with a lot of valuable experience. That's the world you've lived in, and that's not where I came from. And so I'm going to miss things, right? Like I'm not going to know, we should be doing this certain automation, or we should be using these different sets of tools. And so, that I think it's important to realize that you have experience that's very valuable that I don't have, and I love to hear that perspective.
Yeah. The word agency comes to mind there a little bit, in the sense of, like, oftentimes you might have one QA at every 5 engineers or 2 QA at every 10 engineers, right? And you're much less of a cog in a wheel than maybe your standard engineer is. And that's not necessarily a shot at engineers by any means, but it feels like you guys are a little bit more like task oriented. And then there's kind of QA, which is this massively multi-discipline industry that has no formal education feeder system. And it's like, all right, now you guys do QA, right? And even do QA is this massive simplification. And it feels like what I'm hearing, and I've heard in other conversations, is it's so important for QA folks to recognize that, like, they have to break out their job even into different pieces for the engineering leaders. Like, hey, this is the amount of time that we need to spend on new features. This is the amount of time that we need to spend on regression testing. And I would imagine, just because of the sheer complexity of the problem, that engineering leaders, like, care about it, but they're also care about this entire product line and the entire platform. And would you say it's, and I just kind of echo this back, it feels much better to have QA feel like, hey, this is how we think we should do it, or come to me with a couple different strategies, or this is kind of the cost of automation versus that automation, is kind of in line with what you're saying. Does that seem like it's a fair characterization?
Yeah, absolutely. I want, QA to, I guess, have a seat at the table, right? As we talk about what our process is going to look like and how we're going to do things. It's important that you bring that perspective.
Yeah. How would you advise QA to approach conflict? And what I mean by that is, a product person says, here's how it's supposed to work. And then we say, here's all the ways that it's not going to work, right? What do you want to do with this? What do you want to do with this? And sometimes in QA, it can kind of become burnout, where it feels like we're constantly getting in the way of the engineers, and that the engineers are just not really, they're like, God, this is so annoying. Why did you give this back to me? Or why did you give this back to me? Is there ways to make that easier for the engineering team and the engineering leadership? Or, like, because sometimes it can become such a friction relationship that's, they feel like they're blockers of each other as opposed to one team. Like, how do you create a QA department that an engineering team really appreciates?
Yeah, I think that's all about just communication and communicating expectations up front, about how detailed are we going to be in doing QA, and what I've typically done is, like, we kind of set a standard of, look, this was the feature we're trying to build. If the feature works, we're going to pass it. We love when you find other things outside of that feature that may or may not be related. As we do, we'll log them, and we'll put them in the backlog as a future bug to fix. I think it's about communication, being very upfront about, like, how are we going to go about these things. And again, it kind of goes back to the product we're building, right? Because if we're building a mission critical product, then we're going to be a lot tighter, and we're going to want QA to put up blockers for any kind of bugs that are being seen, right? So I think it's just about making sure everybody's on the same page as to, how critical are we going to be of these features before they go out the door.
Yeah. No, that echoes the point of, I ran operations for a startup, and we would balance almost 200 known bugs in the system at any given time. And most of them were these really minor use cases. And I have worked with other QA teams where that just bothers their soul. And I think it's interesting because the word perspective, right, is just that's going to be the reality for a lot of companies, right? And sometimes, though, those perspectives change, where it's like, this bug's been in production, and then suddenly a business leader goes, why is this in production? And then suddenly the QA person's like, oh, we reported this 6 months ago. And you just kind of have to live in the gray area. And so in some ways, it's just kind of I think you're not alone in that. That seems like a lot of engineering leaders are just like, look, we don't have the time and resources to fix all these bugs. This is going to be the reality. We'll try to get back to it. And that's kind of what most engineering leaders are like in your perspective, or is it just completely dependent on the situation?
I would say, from my experience, that is, I would say, the majority. But I think it again goes back to what are we working on, and what level of quality do we need to implement.
Yeah, makes sense. What's your perspective on the role of your engineering team and their responsibilities from a QA perspective? Like, I would imagine unit tests fall under your developers in general. Are they writing their own integration tests too? Are they writing their own end-to-end test? Like, where do you see the crossover in today's world? Because there's a lot of teams actually that would even argue that we don't need QA anymore because they're just giving their developers automation tests. What's your current perspective on QA in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, you definitely can't automate everything. So in general, the development team is writing their own unit tests for their code. And that's always the case that I've seen. And then the rest of it can be a little bit of a blend. I would say in most cases, if I'm fortunate enough to have a separate QA team, they're going to be doing the integration and regression and any kind of automation as well. And that's how I would prefer to work and see it. I think it also, that seems to shift with the size of the organization. The smaller the org, the more QA falls on engineers. And as your orgs get larger and you're able to have a larger QA presence, that's when you'll see the shift the other way.
Yeah. And that actually raises another question, which is, do you feel like there are sort of engineering leaders out there that don't recognize the complexity and scale that an automation suite can take? Because I do feel like a very common trope for QA is like, go automate this. And like, they have a really hard time. And I think the answer comes down to a lot of communication, but they have a really hard time like explaining like, this is like very close to real project level development where you have your data and you have all your like test management structures and you have architecture decisions and environmental decisions. What's your current perspective on engineering leaders as a whole and their kind of respect on the complexity of automation? Is there trends there, or is it just kind of case by case?
Well, I don't want to speak for every engineering leader.
Make massive generalizations.
Yeah, I mean, I from my own experience, I can say that it really wasn't until, more recently that I had an appreciation for the level of effort that goes into like QA automation, like you mentioned. And so, yeah, like for me personally, I never understood, why something took so long. And I think I really oversimplified it in my mind. Like, we'll throw it over the fence to QA and, they do their thing and, they just run a bunch of scripts and, it spits out what we want to see. And obviously, it's much more complicated than that.
Yeah. It seems like a very common situation is you have kind of an entry-level manual engineer who's good at sort of knows how to QA. An engineering leader says, let's automate this. Manual kind of QA goes in with a lot of enthusiasm, but then really doesn't know what they're doing. And because of the weight of the complexity of it, doesn't really get off the ground. Then like engineering leader goes, why aren't we getting value from automation? And it's just kind of this thing that plays out over and over again. And in some ways, it sort of seems like it's you don't really have oftentimes the engineering leadership where it's like, oh, we know the tool set already, we know the framework, where like if you were starting a development project, you probably know, like, I think we should use this framework, I think we should use this, we should be in TypeScript or whatever, right? And so on that front, in the last minute or two, and sorry, I just got a lot of weird feedback in my ears all of a sudden, so that was why I just paused. Anything sort of perspective-wise on the world of QA in sort of your career that you want to share that maybe I haven't touched on just in the last 2 to 3 minutes about kind of particularly your changing in size of organizations, different kinds of organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say one of the things I've found interesting as I've I've been doing this over 20 years now. So
we're all getting old.
I think one message I would have for somebody new coming in is like, if it feels like you just don't have it together. It feels like everything is not perfect. And it feels like things are a mess. You're not alone. I've never worked anywhere, Amazon included. And I think from the outside, you feel like, wow, Amazon's really got it together, but you find the same patterns everywhere, the same struggles everywhere. Like you just feel like, you just don't have it together, and we need to do this and that and this and that. And I think, you're going to see that. And what you do is you just iterate on it, right? You make small improvements where you can and just strive to get better. But I think you'll never reach perfect, and that's okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's and it's mathematically impossible at some point to ever reach perfect when it comes to QA, right? There's just too many possible iterations. Jeremy, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead. Finish.
It goes back to saying, like, we don't have unlimited time and money, because if we did, we could get there and we could have perfect QA. So you'll never be there, and don't beat yourself up about it.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. And the great thing about a lot of QA I've met is they take tremendous pride in their work, and then sometimes that sort of becomes this situation where every bug that hits production is just like another dagger to their heart, as opposed to recognizing, like, how do we iterate? How do we make this better? Jeremy, I really appreciate it. I know that we probably could have kept picking your brain for another half an hour, but I want to try to keep these in around this 20-minute mark. Thank you so much for joining, and I really appreciated all your perspective on everything.
Yeah, absolutely. This was fun.
Yeah. All right. Talk soon, everyone.